Ah, Frog King. Classic tale of a princess kissing a frog and revealing that he's actually a handsome king. Or did she just let him spend 3 nights in her bedroom? No, wait, she threw him against a wall, right? No. He was actually a snake and she ripped him in half. That's what turned him back into a handsome king. Wait, what? The Frog King, being one of the oldest fairy tales around, has a lot of different versions too, including one all the way over in Scotland. The Grimms, who we discussed in the last video, collected fairy tales in the 18th century, and the oldest version of the Frog King they could find was from the 11th century, 700 years earlier. But as most fairy tales started as oral stories, it could very well be much older. And yes, this is the story where the trope of kissing a frog to reveal a prince comes from, but that's not the version we're reading today. Speaking of tropes, despite being one of the more famous fairy tales, it doesn't feature all the major ones. There's no evil stepmother here, and frankly the Wicked Witch is an afterthought, but it hits some of the important ones, like your fairy tale princess and king, a handsome prince, and it's even set in a castle in the forest. This has always been one of the more popular fairy tales, and it's easy to see why. It's a fun little story with wholesome morals, the sort of thing you'd be happy to tell your kids. Unlike the last one we read about children butchering each other. It was also the very first story in the collection, so it was simply a case that more people read it. A lot of fairy tales lend themselves well to analysis by modern writers, and boy, Frog King is no exception. Despite having a small cast and a simple premise and very little action, there's been a lot of focus on the analysis in modern times. One major theme is pretty obvious, but there's some other interesting features in the story that we'll take a look at. I won't spoil them, so see if you can guess the themes as we read along. Once upon a time, when wishes still came true, there lived a king who had beautiful daughters. The youngest was so lovely that even the sun, which had seen so many things, was filled with wonder when it shone upon her face. There was a deep, dark forest near the king's castle, and in that forest, beneath an old linden tree, was a spring. Whenever the weather turned really hot, the king's daughter would go out into the woods and sit down at the edge of that old cool spring. And if she was bored, she would take out her golden ball, throw it up into the air, and catch it. That was her favourite plaything. One day it so happened that the golden ball didn't end up in the princess's hands when she reached out to catch it, but it fell onto the ground and rolled right into the water. The princess followed the ball with her eyes, but it disappeared, and the spring was so deep that you couldn't even begin to see the bottom. The princess burst out crying, and she wept louder and louder, unable to control herself. Suddenly a voice could be heard over her wailing. "What's going on, princess? Stones would be moved to tears if they could hear you." The princess turned around to try and figure out where the voice was coming from, and caught sight of the frog, which had stuck its big old ugly head out of the water. "Oh, it's you old splish splasher," she said. "I'm crying because my golden ball has fallen into the spring." "Be quiet, and just stop that snivelling," said the frog. "I think I can help you. But what will you give me if I fetch you your little plaything?" "Whatever you want, dear frog," she said. "My dresses, my pearls and jewels, even the golden crown I'm wearing." The frog said, "I haven't the least interest in your dresses, your pearls and jewels, or your golden crown. But if you promise to love me and let me be your companion and playmate, let me sit beside you at the table and eat from your little golden plate, let me drink from your little cup, and let me sleep in your little bed. If you promise me all that, I'll dive down right into the spring and bring back your golden ball." "Oh, thank you," she said. "I'll give you anything you want as long as you get that ball back for me." But all the while she was thinking, what nonsense that stupid little frog is talking. He's down there in the water croaking away with all the other frogs. How would anyone want to have him as a companion? Once the frog had gotten her word, he put his head back into the water and dove down into the spring. After a while he came paddling back with the ball in his mouth, and he tossed it onto the grass. When the princess saw the beautiful plaything in front of her, she was overjoyed. She picked it up and ran off with it. "Wait for me!" the frog cried out. "Take me with you. I can't run the way you can." He croaked as loudly as he could, but it did him no good at all. The princess had lost interest in him, hurried home as fast as her legs would carry her, and quickly forgot about the poor frog, who had to crawl back down into the spring. The next day the princess sat down to dinner with the king and some courtiers, and was eating dinner from her little golden plate, when something came crawling up the marble staircase. Splish, splash, splish, splash. When it reached the top of the stairs, it knocked at the door and called out, "Princess, youngest princess, let me in." The princess ran to the door to see who was there. When she opened it, she saw the frog standing in front of her. Terrified, she slammed the door as hard as she could and returned to the table. The king could see that her heart was pounding like mad, and he said, "My child, what are you afraid of? Is there some kind of giant at the door coming after you?" "Oh no," she replied. It wasn't a giant, it was just a disgusting frog. What in the world does a frog want with you? Oh, father dear. Yesterday when I was playing by the spring, my little golden ball fell into the water. And because I was crying so hard, the frog got it for me. And because he insisted, I promised he could become my companion. I never thought he would be able to leave the water. Now he's outside, demanding to come in to see me. Just then, there was another knock at the door, and a voice cried out, "Princess, little princess, let me in. Think back now to yesterday's oath. Down by the cold, blue water. Princess, little princess, let me in." The king declared, "Once you make a promise to someone, you have to keep it. Just go and let him in." The princess went over and opened the door. The frog hopped right into the room and followed close at her heels until she reached her chair. Then he sat down and cried out, "Lift me up and put me next to you." The princess hesitated, but the king ordered her to obey. Once the frog was up on the chair, he wanted to get on the table, and once he was there, he said, "Push your little golden plate closer to me so that we can eat together." The princess did as he said, but it was plain to see that she was not happy about it. The frog had enjoyed his meal, but every bite she had stuck in her throat. Finally, he said, "I've had enough to eat, and I'm really tired. Take me up to your room and turn down the silken covers on your little bed." The princess began to weep, for she was terrified of the clammy frog. She didn't dare touch him, and now that he was going to sleep in her beautiful, clean bed. The king grew angry and said, "You shouldn't scorn someone who helped you when you were in trouble." The princess picked up the frog with 2 fingers, carried him up to her room, and put him in a corner. While she was lying in bed, he came crawling over to her and said, "I'm tired and want to sleep as much as you do. Lift me up into your bed, or I'll tell your father." The princess became really annoyed, picked up the frog, and threw him with all her might against the wall. "Now you get your rest, you disgusting frog." When the frog fell to the ground, he was no longer a frog, but a prince with beautiful, bright eyes. At her father's bidding, he became her dear companion and husband. He told her that a wicked witch had cast a spell on him, and that only a princess could release him. The next day they planned to set out together for his kingdom. The 2 fell asleep, and in the morning, after the sun had woken them up, a coach drove up. It was drawn by 8 white horses in golden harnesses, with white ostrich feathers on their heads. At the back of the coach stood Faithful Henrik, the servant of the young king. Faithful Henrik had been so saddened by the transformation of his master into a frog, that 3 hoops had been placed around his chest to keep his heart from bursting with pain and sorrow. Now the coach had arrived to take the young king back to his kingdom, and Faithful Henrik lifted the 2 of them up into the carriage and took his place in the rear. He was elated by his master's transformation. When they had covered a good distance, the prince heard a cracking noise behind them, as if something had broken. He turned around and cried out, "Henrik, the coach is in danger!" "No, my lord. It's not the coach, but a hoop from around my heart, which was in deep pain while you were down in the spring, living as a frog." 2 more times the prince heard the cracking noise, and he was sure that the coach was falling apart. But it was only the sound of the hoops breaking from around Faithful Henrik's chest, for his master had been set free, and he was happy at last. So, we got to talk about the frog. In the past, that was a symbol of awakening sexuality and fertility, because of the obvious changes it goes through as they grow, from a tadpole to an adult frog. Whenever people in the past saw a frog in a fairy tale, they'd instantly know the story was about becoming an adult or having kids. That's something to keep in mind when reading any fairy tale. They're full of symbols that were well known to people in the past, but that we've lost. One of the symbols that still comes through clearly is the sharing of a meal. The frog insists on eating from her plate and drinking from her cup, something that's intimate even by today's standards. She's not ready for this level of intimacy and even gags from it. In fact, she's repulsed by the frog the entire time, which makes the theme of her as a young woman afraid of becoming an adult very clear. Some people say the frog in this story straight up represents, what will YouTube let me say, male genitals? Even going so far as to compare the visuals of the slimy frog. When you consider the whole of what the frog represents though, it's a little bit deeper than that. The frog isn't just her suitor, he's the whole act of development into an adult. Consider what he requests from her. He doesn't want a gold or a jewels, he wants a relationship. He wants something active. Becoming an adult isn't just something that's given to you or inherited. You know, she's got a lot of things that she's inherited in the story. She's a beautiful princess with many trinkets, and these things were all given to her. And her greatest challenge is taking action. That's why the prince being freed is the result of a kiss, or being torn apart, or the princess actually upholding her promise. It's her action that frees him. Nobody else, not the frog or the king, can do this for her. And even then it's not easy. She and the frog play at a relationship before it really clicks. They eat together and sleep together before she finally accepts the external and internal transformations. It's the act of accepting her own transformation that changes the prince from something disgusting into something wonderful. It's getting over that fear of changing that lets her see how beautiful the change can be. The frog becoming a man isn't about him becoming physically handsome, but more about the princess's view of him. He's no longer something intimidating and unwelcome, he's an appropriate match for her spiritually. By growing through her own actions, she recognises her own place in the world, and she can see the world more clearly now. The raw physicality of the exchange has been replaced by the spiritual nature of their union. It's no longer just a gross physical act to her. The princess has now accepted their union because she understands it on a deeper, more spiritual level. So, alright, cool. It's a big metaphor for sex, got it. So what's the deal with Heinrich at the end? Heinrich represents loyalty. He appears when the couple are together at the end. He's the most important ingredient for a relationship to function, loyalty. His heart being unbound by the iron rings, his love blooming after waiting faithfully and performing the assigned duties. Kind of like the princess's own journey. By performing the duties expected of her, the frog changed into a king. Look, I know this all sounds pretty sus by today's standards, but this story is hundreds, if not 1,000 years old by now. But that's the point of the series, right? Mining fairy tales for anything from the past that might be valuable. Well, how's this then? Being forced into traditional roles, especially when you promise to do it, is good. Humans do pretty well in those roles. We have thousands of years of evidence for that. And that's at the heart of this story. Life is scary. Even the things we're built to do are challenging, but you have the strength of the past to draw on. The princess was terrified of the promise she herself made, but she had the solid strength of her father to guide her. It meant the end of a carefree life as a child, but it led to a spiritual growth and richness of life that she would be unable to reach without that struggle. And we all need help sometimes. It's only human to need help. And we have our family and tradition to lean on in those times. The frog's part is interesting too. He took a risk helping her and courting her. The princess was nothing but a spoiled girl at the start. It would have been a safer bet to take the treasure, but he saw something in her. Perhaps he was just driven by lust too. The analytic focus of this story is usually centered on the princess and her transformation, but the frog transforms too. Is this actually the story of the taming of male passions by a woman, transforming him into a suitable husband? He appears first as a beast willing to bargain to get what he wants, and ends up a charming king by the end, which is a nice mirror to her. The transformations of boys and girls into men and women through marriage is a really old symbol. These four figures, the daughter, the son, the mother, and the father, correspond to the four elements in classical European occultism: earth, wind, fire, and water. The princess, Earth, plays in the forest and comes across a spring of water. She doesn't want to enter it. She doesn't want to become the mother just yet. The frog refuses a golden crown, a medal linked with fire and the king/father figure. He doesn't want to grow up just yet either. They both want to have their fun first, although their ideas of fun are a little different. Returning to the symbols of the past we still understand, the king is definitely one. He's an obvious symbol of authority in this figure, doing double duty as a king, as an arbiter of state and tradition, and as a father as the head of household. He's a relatively minor character in this, basically just having a handful of lines, but he's vital for the princess's development. Without that father upholding tradition and having his daughter marry, and upholding morals by making her stand by her word, she wouldn't have grown and would have just stayed a petulant child. She would need a push to grow sometimes. Total freedom is worthless without some guidance, and it's the father's job to do so. It's important to note that while he forced her to take these steps, it wasn't before she was ready. The actual age of the princess isn't stated, and her level of maturity varies significantly. Some artists draw her as an actual child, but others draw her as a young woman. Her actual age isn't really that important, other than knowing she was old enough to be married. And honestly, in the Middle Ages, when this story was first conceived, this was a pretty grey area anyway. Either way, it's clear she was holding on to her childishness because of the fear of becoming an adult, and her father understood that. This story is a very traditional one. Not only is it one of the oldest in the Brothers Grimm collection, it's simply a very traditional household story. There's a lot of ways you can look at it, from a big metaphor into growing into an adult, or just a simple tale of a girl scared about marriage. It really shows that people of the past were scared about pretty much the same things we are today. Growing up is really scary, whether you're a boy or a girl. In today's world, nobody really knows what it means to be an adult other than paying taxes, and we're expected to figure it out ourselves. Moving away from tradition has freed us from a lot of negative aspects of the past, but in return we're left without much guidance. One thing tradition provides us is a clear set of rules to follow. If you're scared, just do what worked before, and chances are it'll work again. Blindly following tradition has a lot of issues, but throwing it out entirely brings just as many. So what do you think is valuable about today's story? Did you agree with my reading of it, or do you think I'm totally wrong? Do you think there are other metaphors I missed? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the second in the series taking a look at fairy tales. I'm aiming to try and get these videos finished in one a week, but I'm not quite as fast as I'd like to be. But yeah, it's all practice. Yeah, so let me know what you thought about the video down in the comments. It's always much appreciated. And the next video will actually be on my second channel, which is linked down below. It's a little bit different, which is why it's not on this channel, but hopefully you guys like it too. And that will take a bit longer, so there will be a little bit of a break between videos. But rest assured, I'll be working hard on that. Thank you again for watching. I've been your host, Morday Doog, and it's been a pleasure.